So one of the things that we were talking about was providing the easy to use, easy to customize for like the novice UI. So essentially we would have tabs for various things. So like that, the ledger. I was mentioning ledger and he just did like a very quick like representation of this, space, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not an indication of how we would design a ledger. But the idea is essentially that you can minimize and expand different aspects of the UI. You can pull these tabs. You would have different tabs, so like maybe one's a ledger, maybe a guild page, social page, etc. up here. Sort of minimize, expand. But then there's also a space down here where if you've got something that's like a frequently used, one of the other tabs that's frequently used that you want to keep on a top level, then you can easily drag it in and it will make it so that you can scroll through that as well. We've talked about, is there sort of a summarized or overview version of that page, but that adds a bit of additional complexity in like figuring out what that should be. So here he's got character description below here, but then in a second clicks to another tab that's like a ledger and then minimizes that. So it's just the ledger now. And then I think, then he pulls the tab off. So you can have all of your various tabs up if you want and manage them separately. So what is the ledger? Shlomo, we were just talking about essentially anytime you buy, sell, trade, delete, loot, anything related to an item, having an item ledger so you can kind of go through your history and see where that transaction happened. Yeah, so it's essentially it's a text log, but it's parsing it in a way where it's useful. And then the other thing that I'd like to experiment with is anytime you join a group, you get like an entry of you joined a group at this time and maybe zone name. So you know the zone and you know who was in the group when you joined it. Then you would also see anybody that joins the group or leaves the group. You would see those transactions in there. And it would likely be filterable, customizable. So maybe there's someone sends you a tell or you trade with somebody, which you would then have it in two different ledgers. You'd be able to see it in your item ledger, you see it in your social ledger. And the idea for that was, I don't know about you, but I've had these times where I've been like, oh man, that group last night was really good, but I forgot to note who was in the group and blah, blah, blah. And I could go back to last night and see the people's name, and ideally if we're putting that in there, then we can also make it easy for you to like link add them to a friends list or immediately send them a tell from there. Just simple click kind of interface, just to help make it easier for the average person to keep track of that sort of information. And will there be a way to transfer items and or currency between all characters without requiring a second party, e.g. shared bank space? Maybe. Yeah, datum. That's my biggest question for Ali and the guys is just cost, but I think there's a certain amount of that information that can just be stored on the client side. It's simple data. It can be stored on the client side, and we don't necessarily care if somebody manipulates that, because we'll have our own record of those transactions as well. Right, because I'm assuming the trade, all of the item related transactions aren't that horrible to store because we have that information in other MMOs. Otherwise, we can't do customer service. Right? Like if someone's like, oh, I no longer have my, Fiery Avenger. I don't know what happened to it. Eventually, somebody in customer service has got to look and go, oh, you deleted it, dummy. But like some of the social stuff, we could do client side and not have to store any of it because we don't necessarily care who you group with. Though there are metrics related to grouping we should be tracking, because I think there's some good data that we can arrive at with regards to like player retention. If we're seeing that there's player churn in the early game, have those players interacted with other players? Have they grouped with other players? Are we seeing that players that don't group with other players are churning faster than players who do group with other players within the first 30 minutes or first day, 3 days, 7 days? And then, or the opposite, maybe everybody that groups with other people they're quitting day one, but everybody that's just playing on their own is not quitting, that kind of thing. Then we could also look at potentially match that against different classes and see, okay, our shadow, or necromancer's just not grouping, or that type of thing. Are we seeing disparity in the amount of grouping for certain classes? Does that mean those, then we could dig in. Does that mean that those classes have a tendency to not want to group? Or are those classes chosen by people who feel like they don't have time to group? Or does everybody hate the druid and they're not grouping with them? That kind of thing. Might be too early to ask, Shlomo asks, but have you decided on how big the server should be, as in player population? With regards to the shared bank space, one of the concerns that we have there is we're trying to find ways to... We want to maintain the integrity of the world and the scope, like the scale of it, etc., as much as possible. And we want to be careful that we don't create a situation where it's easy to, with something like a shared bank space, to easily just sort of toss things in there and essentially teleport items to other parts of the world instantly and negate the value of other systems that we're putting in, or just sort of the feel of having to move stuff from one place to another, etc. So it's something we're going to screw around with and probably have some arguments, see where we land, make sure we're not being too punishing, but not giving away the farm from the onset. Yeah, I was just talking to one of our animation candidates. I was mentioning, like, I've always thought of MMOs as like the old TV show Cheers, where you've got this like nice cozy place where people know who you are. You can come in, they're like, Norm, you want to go where everybody knows your name. Then the other analogy is like the nightclub. No one wants to go to an empty nightclub. It really comes down to making sure that we maintain the appropriate level of player density. What that is, we'll have to see. Perhaps the ability to delegate local bank access to specific players. Well, we've talked about having the merchant bags, right? That's essentially the merchant bag is like I think I've called it an escrow bag in the past. And so the escrow bag is something where you agree upon the conditions of transfer with the individual that has the bag. Right, so people have asked about in Discord recently, what are we planning on doing with merchants? Are we going to put in like a bazaar system or auction house or anything like that? And we've said, no, we don't want to put in an auction house or have bazaar bots sitting around everywhere. What we want to do is combine both the sort of manual sales process that's common in like an EQ, where you saw it, depending on the server, mostly in EC Tunnel or some places it's North Freeport or whatever. So we want to encourage the people that like to min-max and play the trading game. We want to encourage that behavior, but for the people that don't want to do that and are like, I just want to sell my shit, we have a bag or a container, because it could be a big case or chest on a wagon or something if somebody's a traveling merchant or whatever. But essentially we want a concept of a container that allows me as the seller to set the terms with the person that is the trader, I guess. So, or better yet, I'm the owner of the item, the potential seller or trader of the item, and then the person that's going to purchase the item. I can say that we agree upon, essentially through the interface of the bag, you've got 1 day or the item returns to me. Basically, I want 100 gold for the item. And we agree upon that. If the person selling it, basically they get the item, then they've got possession of it, they can sell that item for 200 gold and keep the 100 gold and I get my 100 gold, essentially. And you can set like a sort of a commission price on that as well. So maybe it's, I want 100 gold, or really I want 90 gold because, yeah, I want 90 gold. So you have to sell it for 100 gold and you can keep 10%. Then if they sell it for 200 gold, then they keep the 10% of the 100, so they get that 10, and then they get 110 off the trade. I get my 90. If they delete the item, it gets returned to me. If they log out and don't log back in for 3 days, after a day, it gets returned to me. That kind of thing. So I've got the feeling that's going to be a system that's got all sorts of brokenness to it and exploits and other shit that Ali's going to have to really work with the guys to like figure out all of the weird edge cases. But essentially the idea was, is there a secure way that we can have someone else have possession of your items for certain transaction types to allow for more flexibility in the area of trade. So yeah, it's easier for me to explain that one on paper than it is for me to ramble about it here, but you get the gist. So in theory, if we have a system like that, then we could also have a system in which we allow for the transfer of items, the safe transfer of items. And so that could be a thing too. You know, allow people to hold items for you for a certain amount of money, and you either get them back on your original character or they complete the transfer that you've agreed upon, which is, hey, when you see my alt little Timmy come in, then give little Timmy this item, and then you'll get 5 gold for the transaction. Sounds like a consignment system. That's probably the correct English terminology for what I've been describing. Triple Hex Lilith says EVE Online does the transport contracts where you pay some amount higher than the value of item, which is returned to you when you deliver on the contract, along with reward for the contract. Okay, cool. I'm just gonna snip this so I don't forget it, and I'm gonna put it in my notes section on Slack. Above that, Sergeant asked, what about guild bank idea? Kind of like what was introduced with guild hall. Yeah, I think when we start digging into guild features, I can't imagine why we wouldn't have a guild bank. Now, regular banks, we may wind up using the flagging as well that like this guy uses, where it could be that regular banks don't want you storing shit in there like bloody ogre heads or something like that. They could be, sorry, you can't store this in a bank, and then you need to get your own like apartment or whatever to keep all your creepy shit in. So Silencer is commenting on the use of that system that Lilith mentioned for scams and things in EVE. Given the like PvE nature of our game, mostly, I think there's likely some good stuff to learn from that system that will be maybe less grief prone in our environment. Jodgers, thank you for the follow. Okay, so Datum said, if you're using a nightclub analogy, it's about the mix. I know that servers are a classic way to think about a game, but what about a system that works to maintain density, but also facilitates social grouping by putting people together by who they like to play with and always maintain a minimum of new player interactions? Sounds like it's a system that has enough complexity behind it that I would be afraid that we would screw up the mix and overcomplicate things whereas we could just start with essentially a classic sort of sharded system and kind of see how that goes from there. That makes sense. Hey, Isan, please move the in-game camera. You're making us all sick. What? Oh, because you're looking at a gnome. I get what you're saying. Here, I'll look out here, even though you're being silly. Let me get us a nice view. What about bankers being able to hold something in the same manner for a fee and only at that location? That's not a bad idea. Having an NPC that can do it. Then it would become a sort of a question, and maybe we could have both, the opportunity for players and for NPCs, and then it just becomes a question of what we're really worried about, the social aspect of it or the currency drain aspect of it. That's pretty much a local auction house then. Not if it's specific to the player, right? I mean, in theory, I guess you could say that would work as an auction house, but it's single transaction at a time. So it's a pretty inefficient auction house. That may be a great argument for keeping it for players only, though. As soon as you said that's an auction house, I'm like, son of a bitch. You may have a point. People are like, too much brown. But not really an auctioneer because there's no flexibility in price. The transaction's already made. Basically, I would have to interact with you. I'd have to go, Cerebrum's going to buy this thing for me. In the example we used, it wasn't even a sell. We're saying I pay 5 gold for the NPC to hand this item that I'm giving them to specifically Little Timmy. Little Timmy is my alt, or it could be another player. But the NPC would always charge 5 gold. And all it's doing is handing it to somebody else. So somewhere along the way, you would have to negotiate the price, and you would have to exchange the cash for it. So to me, it seems like an extremely ass-backwards way of doing a trade. Ever consider a high-level summon ethereal bank, a single-use pouch that allows you to access your bank? Expensive reagent cast, but tradable. Proof on log, maybe. Rev Chumley, I think when the time comes, we can play around with ideas and try to figure out all the edge cases for how it might be exploited, but a thing like that seems like it could be fun and People would still have to bark their whales. Honestly, I think it'd be a good thing where people could buy things in asymmetric time. You may be onto something there, but again, we'd have to, like, while I'm actually thinking and not stream thinking, sit down and go, all right, so what are the implications though? Yeah, I think whatever we wind up calling it, that the commission box or escrow system or whatever, I believe that providing that functionality is going to have a benefit for us. Because there are a number of people that really do enjoy just playing the trading game. One of the richest people on my server back in the day was a guy that was like level 15 or something. His name was Trade Cats, and all he did was trade. And we wound up eventually bringing him into our guild. But like, the guy, he knew who had what items and what items had dropped and just everything. Yeah, so Trade Cats, all he did was buy and sell shit. And he is worth millions. You guys doing quality control in this game? Looks like someone misspelled that NPC's name. How dare you? You trolls. Keep being a troll and see what happens to your race. You saw Zukin working on troll models, actually? If you trolls keep it up, we'll see what happens to Zukin's troll models. I can see it now. Sean's threatening trolls on stream. Fine, tell my boss.